Right after the Second World War, the business community, the country was social democratic, very social democratic at that time, and they knew it. And the business leaders said that they had to renew with vigor what they called the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinate citizens with the capitalist story. And the reason is the truth is subversive, it's anti-American, and has to be eliminated, and it was destroyed with a tremendous power play. This covered everything from the entertainment industry to the corporate media to the schools and so on. Billions of dollars a year were devoted to this, taking over schools, churches, recreational activities, anything you can think about. The corporate media, of course, are right in the center of it. The films were quite important, commercial films as well as propaganda films. Propaganda films were reaching 20 to 30, business propaganda was reaching 20 to 30 million people a year in the early 50s. Business was providing about a third of all school materials. This was not a small thing. On top of that, there's a whole commercial industry, like, the standard depiction of unions in the movies is sort of Marlon Brando on the waterfront, tough working class Joe stands up against union bosses, and because that's and unions in fact were portrayed as something that the workers have to fight against, and a huge amount of energy and effort was put into this. It was pretty successful. This picked up again in the 1970s. There was another upsurge with foundations trying to take over the educational institutions, so Olin professorships of free enterprise and glossy right-wing student magazines, very well funded all over the place, and so on and so forth. It's had an effect. The effect has been to pretty much demolish civil society, to turn people into what is the ideal. The ideal is very clear. The ideal is a completely fragmented, atomized society where everyone's totally alone, doing nothing but trying to pursue created wants, and the wants are created. It's known that they're created. Nobody wants those things. You create wants. People are stuck with their television set or their interactive whatever it is, and they're glued to this thing, and they're told what they want, and they have to want it. They don't have any connection with anyone else. You don't see anybody else. You don't deal with anyone else. You're an atom of consumption. And you go to work at lower and lower wages for more and more hours and less benefits and security in a flexible labor market. That's the kind of utopia that they're looking for, and it's not very far from there. It's led to very strange effects in the country. The country is like a devastated peasant society. You really have to go back to Europe in the Black Death, I think, 14th century, to find anything similar. People are scared, angry, hostile, hate everything, don't know what they hate, don't have anybody else to talk to, just angry, desperate. There are cults all over the place at a scale that is unknown in any other society. You have to, the level of religious fundamentalism alone is probably the highest in the world. I'm almost certain higher than Iran, and that's only one of them. The people right now, the militias happen to be on the front pages, but that's just a tiny fragment of it, and it's only not the right. The left is the same. It's across the board. It's just a dissolved society, very scary. The portent is ominous. It's the kind of a situation, and it's a kind of a situation which is indeed reminiscent of Germany in the late 30s in a lot of ways, or Iran in the late 70s. At the same time, it's a kind of an organizer's dream. People, if you look at people's attitudes, they remain social democratic. People are overwhelmingly believe that working people ought to have more influence. They don't have enough. That the government ought to help poor people. That's its job. That people are overwhelmingly opposed to things like budget balancing, if, for example, it's going to cut down educational or health expenditure, and so on across the board. As I say, it doesn't matter because it's irrelevant to policy. They do what they like. But it's a situation in which the opportunities for organizing and rebuilding a democratic culture are very, very high. And it can be done, but it's certainly not going to happen by itself. It's going to happen take the same kind of energy and activism that it's taken to lift us out of feudalism and slavery and every other horror in the past. What has been created by this half century of massive corporate propaganda is what's called anti-politics. So anything that goes wrong, you blame the government. Well, okay, there's plenty to blame the government about. But the government is the one institution in which that people can change. It's the one institution you can affect by participation without institutional change, right? That's exactly why all the anger and fear is directed against the government. The government has a defect. It's potentially democratic. Corporations have no defect. They're pure tyrannies. So therefore you want to keep corporations invisible and focus all anger on the government. So you don't like something, your wages are going down, blame the government, not blame the guys in the Fortune 500, because you don't read the Fortune 500, thing. You just read what they tell you in the newspapers. So you don't read about the dazzling profits and the stupendous this and the wages going down and so on. All you know is that the bad government's doing something, so let's get mad at the government. As I say, plenty to be mad about the government, but the government is exactly what Dewey described it as. It's the shadow cast by business over society. You want to change something, change the substance, not the shadow. And everyone contributes to this, including the Democrats. They're deeply committed to it. You take a look at the Clinton campaign literature. It's like, it's a I don't know what public relations firm wrote it, but whatever one did it understands their business. The thing that they were giving out at the drugstores, 10 cents on their mandate for change, as they called it, incidentally a slogan that they borrowed from Eisenhower, which shows how much change they contemplated. The first chapter of it was called Entrepreneurial Economics. And that was their big economic program. I explained how we're not old-fashioned liberals, who believe in entitlements and getting children food to eat and that sort of thing. We're interested in entrepreneurial economics. And then they go on to describe it. And it's read it carefully. Very interesting to see how the mind of the commissar works. The way it works is like this. Entrepreneurial economics involves workers and their firms. It's all about workers and their firms. Anybody who works in a firm can tell you how much it's their firms. So there's workers and their firms, and then there's the government, which is going to try to help out the workers and their firms. There's a couple of words that don't appear in it, like profits, bosses, managers. They're not investors. Banks. They don't appear. It's just the workers and their firms. There are entrepreneurs who have a kind of a shadowy existence. They're sort of nice guys who live in the Sloan School or somewhere, and every once in a while they come around and they sort of help out the workers in their firms, and then they kind of disappear somewhere. And that's entrepreneurial economics. Well, okay, that's the kind of thing you're taught to do in good universities, to put things that way. And that's the Democrats. Now, when you got that on one side, and on the other side you got, hate the government because they're responsible for everything and its taxes and the pointy-headed bureaucrats in Washington, but not the ones in the insurance offices, you end up with a mood of what is called anti-politics. And anti-politics is a very scary phenomenon. It can take the form of, that it is taking, forming what shouldn't be called militias, because remember, militias are things raised by states. These are just private armies. Forming private armies to defend the country, the people against, the UN forces being brought in the black helicopters by the Council on Foreign Relations to commit genocide, or whatever story you like. Or else it's, fight against Lucifer and Beast 66, who's doing this, that, and the other thing. And that's what, if you take a look across the country, that's what people are worried about and fighting against. Aliens, the devil, the UN forces, the Federal Reserve, everything except what's real, namely private tyranny, private corporate power, the guys who are listed in the Fortune 500. Well, that's an achievement. That's a propaganda achievement. And while the anger and the fear is real, and it's based on something, and you got to sympathize with it because it is real, when your wages have dropped 25% roughly in, say, 15 years, and, your wife has to work, and your kids can't eat, and so on and so forth, and you have no future, and everything's rotten, you have a lot to be angry about. But people are not focused on what's doing it. That's the difference between the days in which there was a live, functioning labor movement that was organizing these people.